Our second speaker is Dr. Graham Hudson. He is the Associate Professor of Criminology at Ryerson University and is currently conducting a 4-year research project on sanctuary cities in Canada. So welcome.
Thank you very much. It's quite an honor. Very nice to see some familiar faces and nice to meet some new people. I don't have a PowerPoint slide. I've decided to wean myself off of it, but slowly. So I actually design PowerPoint slides, but I want to mention that everything that I'm going to say is part of a 1-year pilot project that I was fortunate enough to conduct with a team of people, including Professor Delacague, Ryerson, Charity, and Michaela Levine, who's a researcher up in London, Ontario. And we are currently starting a 4-year project to look at the sanctuary in Canada in different provinces. The idea is to get a sense of how the different cities are adopting similar policies, and to the extent to which those policies can help each city learn how to address memorizing legal issues that arise from that population. So just by way of a brief background, I want to just take a couple of moments to highlight something that I think is going to be a recurring theme, and that's really important to understand what cities are and can be, and what they are not and should not be. So the first thing to appreciate is that in Canada, we live obviously in the federal state. So immigration law, as well as criminal law for that matter, is a field of law that is produced by the federal government. Provinces have quite a distinct role in governing relationships, economic, social, and political, that relate to the lives of migrants, but officially speaking, they don't have a role in the governance of migration. But something that's important to appreciate is when we talk about sanctuary city, what we're talking about is the right to access services that are provided by the provinces. They have this jurisdiction to set the eligibility criteria as to who in Canada has access to things like education, healthcare, shelters, access to police services, the whole gamut. These are policies that are designed by the provincial government, and as cities, as creatures of the provinces, cities have the authority to open up the access to these services, and it's not something that is incompatible or contrary to immigration law, nor is it something that is fundamentally.
What you have to say is too important to miss. So let's make sure we got the phone working.
I can project my voice.
I can lend you mine. Here it is. Okay. Sure. Thank you. All right. I'll try that.
Is that better?
I think it's just beside the other one.
Testing. That one's working. Great. Well, it can't get any worse, can it? All right. So I was just saying that one thing that we want to appreciate when we're thinking about a sanctuary city, and the question will come up, is what role does a city have in immigration? And to what extent does sanctuary city relate to the federal government's laws with respect to border control and criminalization and protecting safety and security? These are questions that often come up. And I just want to, as a background issue, point out that what we're talking about is access to services that are provided by the provincial government, which has constitutional authority to set eligibility criteria for things like health and education, shelters, social assistance, employment and standards, etc. And cities are directly empowered by provinces. And so I want to talk a little bit about the role of cities in asserting that jurisdiction and claiming a space for itself. And I want to add to this the important point that when we start talking about the policy and the economic difficulties that are caused by having a large non-status population, that this is a problem which is principally, if not exclusively, the responsibility of the federal government and its poorly drafted, I would say, and poorly enforced laws that cities are being left to deal with. And so the policy prescription that I offer today is one where cities actually have not only a legal right, but an economic and a policy priority to push this jurisdictional power that they have to take care of a problem that the federal government really ought to be dealing with. I just want to underline that point by noticing on one thing the financial implications of having non-status population. Because we don't actually have numbers of non-status population in Canada, we don't know what the costs of lack of access is. But what we can do is take a look at the United States, which has done a great deal of research on issues of lack of access and the implications this has for financial and political and criminal justice systems. And so I would refer to you a report by the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy in 2017, which is a nonpartisan think tank that operates outside of Washington, D.C. And it states that in the United States as a national area, the United States makes $11.74 billion in property and sales tax exclusively from undocumented or non-status migrants. And this number could be $14 billion if non-status population was regularized. In the state of California earns $3.2 billion through property and sales tax that's paid by the non-status population, which is in the area of 2.7 million people. So to think of the gravity of the situation, it's something that one ought to consider in Canada, and what role cities have in ensuring that not only are they delivering services, but that they're doing what they should be doing to address some of the fiscal implications that this has. So obviously, because we have a kind of a short history in Canada with Sanctuary City, we don't really know much about whether they're working in a bureaucratic way, whether the City of Toronto as the first Sanctuary City is actually performing its job well. There have been a number of audits have done, and almost all of the audits have pointed out that non-status population in Toronto has inconsistent access to services at best, and in many instances it's almost entirely prohibited. We just learned a little bit here about lack of access to education. We also heard about lack of access to police services. So why is this happening, and what can the town of Ajax, City of Montreal, and Vancouver learn from what Toronto has done right and what it's not done? So just to kind of appreciate what the problem is and the scale of the problem, we should take a look at what Access TO actually does. So in 2013, what City Council did was it directed all city staff and volunteers to do, or not to do, 3 different things. The first is it's not to inquire into immigration status if somebody is looking for services. Sure. Is that good? Okay. So Access TO does 3 things. Right? First thing it does is it directs city staff and volunteers to not ask about immigration status unless it's relevant to a service. So if you're talking about Toronto Public Health, if you're talking about schools, if you're talking about shelters, if you're talking about police, you're not to ask about immigration status unless it's relevant to a service. And the vast majority of services, immigration status is not required by law, statutory law. A second thing that it does is it says that city staff are not to deny services. So if for some reason a staff member becomes aware that an individual is non-status, they're not to use that as a reason to deny service. And the third thing that the Sanctuary City in Toronto does is it says that city staff are not to share any information that they come across, however they may come across it, with federal authorities unless they're required to do so by law. And we can have a conversation about when that might be. And the question that often comes up is a question of criminal law, and if there's an arrest warrant or if somebody's here without authorization, isn't the city obligated to share that information? We can have a conversation about that, but the short answer to that is no. In all circumstances, it's not actually legally required to share that information. It's a matter of discretion, which is informed by a range of human rights values, including, I would add, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So this policy is pretty ambitious if you think about what's going on in Toronto. It's basically saying that of the large number of non-status population in the city, they're entitled to access municipal services regardless of what the federal government might have to say. And so we kind of want to look at how this is working, and it's not working very well, I'm sorry to say.
One of the problems that we have with the City of Toronto is its size, bureaucratic size. There are 21 service areas, 21 divisions and agencies and corporations within the City of Toronto that provide services. I've mentioned a few of them: Children's Services, Toronto Police Services, education, libraries, etc. There are 6 administrative districts over a vast geographical expanse, and there are up to, at any point, 60,000 city staff or volunteers. So for there to be a culture change within the City of Toronto, there needs to be a concrete plan for implementing sanctuary policy. What we discovered, which was not a surprise to a good number of people, is that there was no policy plan in place. City Council proclaimed that there would be access TO. It directed city officials to do the 3 things that I had mentioned. But there was no follow-up with this, and there was no institutional support provided to the city staff. So as an example, there was only $800 of extra funding provided to implement access TO. Most of that money was spent on posters, on public-facing materials like cards, some community outreach, and a little bit of money was spent on training. But the training itself was also insufficient. As Mercedes mentioned, the whole driving force behind the Solidarity movement was at the front line to make sure that there was adequate staff training. The City Council was aware of this, and in the proclamation of Access TO promised to train its staff. Up until now, only 175 staff in the City of Toronto have been trained. Of these, they were all volunteers. No one was trained as a mandatory basis. A good number of individuals decided not to attend the training sessions. The entire division of Parks, Forestry, and Recreation, which runs community centers, a pretty important point of contact with local communities for obvious reasons, didn't think it needed training. In its estimation, it already had the institutional values that were consistent with sanctuary TO, access TO, and so it just didn't show up. There was no service integration at the policy level. There's actually, until very recently, no policy manual. If anyone were to look up Access TO or Sanctuary City Toronto, and I get emails all the time from journalists or researchers, and they say, I can't find Access TO online. And the reason is because it doesn't exist. Until very recently, there was no policy manual that outlined in concrete terms what the implications of this policy was that could be sent to city staff and volunteers. No frontline service integration. So if you kind of think about how the city works on a frontline level, on any given corner, I can use as an example Yonge and Finch. You've got a school, you've got Toronto District School Board, you've got Parks, Forestry, and Recreation, you've got some hospitals in the area, you've got police services, right? But none of these agencies communicate with each other. Working in the same neighborhood, they do not communicate with each other about access TO. So some of these services have individuals who go out into the community and strike relationships, particularly Parks, Forestry, and Recreation and libraries. But there's no integration in an attempt to make sure that everyone who's working on the same dot on the map actually shares resources to make sure that access TO is being delivered on the streets. Not happening. So one of the basic conclusions that we can draw is that access TO has not been implemented and that city staff are continuing to deny services using discretionary authority. This was also brought up, a very key important point here. And what's really going on is that discretion is being administered based on the personal views of individuals who work in the city. And some of those individuals are sympathetic to sanctuary values. Some of those individuals take their responsibility under this policy seriously, and others don't. Others deny services on the basis of race or ethnicity, right? Some of them deny services on the basis of language. Geography is pretty important. An audit done by the FCJ Refugee Center found that you were more likely to get access to services if you were in the downtown core, actually closer to the Yonge line. And the further out you went, especially if you were in Scarborough or Etobicoke, you were less likely to get access to services. So that's arbitrary, right? As a city, there should be a comprehensive rollout of this policy, but it varied not just in terms of race or ethnicity and language, but actually physically where you were in the city. And conceptions of security and economic considerations are other big concerns, that individuals in the city take it upon themselves to police the migrant community or to deny services because in that individual's estimation, it's too costly to provide services, even though policy says that you're obligated as a city staff to provide those services. So there's non-compliance, and it's systematic, and it's relating to the lack of funding and the lack of training. So all of this information came out publicly in February of 2017, not long after Donald Trump and all that stuff was going on south of the border. At that time, Montreal and London passed sanctuary city policies. And the City of Toronto was in an embarrassing situation. There was a lot of media attention as to why the City of Toronto was obviously not complying with its access TO, even though it was a champion of this in terms of making proclamations. It wasn't delivering the goods. And so it made some important changes, which I'd like to talk about, because I do have optimistic kind of sense that what's going on is positive. And I would like to add also that in the interviews that we conducted with the City of Toronto, I can say nothing but positive things about the city staff and officials that work in the policy realm, the individuals who are responsible for trying to make access TO work and take their jobs extremely seriously, and they work very, very hard with very little resources to make it work, but they can only do so much. And so a couple of those individuals work in a part of the City of Toronto called the Toronto Newcomer Office. And this is a really interesting and innovative idea which might be relevant to town of Ajax and certainly other cities. What the Toronto Newcomer Office is first of its kind in Canada. It's a partnership between the City of Toronto and Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada, part of the federal government that deals with the policy and the administrative component of immigration. And the idea here was that as Toronto being the most populous destination for migrants in general, as well as being the home of most non-status migrants, has a really important role to play in service, settlement and integration to ensure that newcomers are finding jobs, that they're being engaged civically, that they're contributing politically, that they're being given opportunities to make the most of their aspirations and their resources. And this division, while it is administered by the City of Toronto, is funded up until recently entirely by the federal government. So you have this line of communication between the City of Toronto and the federal government precisely on the needs of newcomers in the areas of economy and human rights and policy and community development. So what, to its credit, the City of Toronto did was it transferred the Access TO file to Toronto Newcomer Office. And at that point, it was given $140,000 worth of funding to deliver Access TO and various other policies that relate to refugees. The Toronto Newcomer Office also has some connections with the CBSA, which we'll talk about in a bit. Is the enforcement arm of immigration. And it also has connections with provincial ministries, specifically in the area of migration. We're talking Ontario Works, we're talking Ministry of Education, Community Safety and Policing. So there's an opportunity here for the City of to have a conversation with the provincial and federal government about the issue of non-status migration. And finally, the Toronto Newcomer Office is one of the only policy branches in the City of Toronto that has a very strong connection to the community. It's got partnerships with upwards of 30 local organizations that work in settlement and integration, including agencies like the Refugee Startup Project, FCJ Refugee Center, Wood Green, different shelters. It's got connection both to the federal government but also to the local level. So what has it been up to? In June, I just double-checked my email, on the 16th and the 23rd respectively, the City of Toronto will release a policy manual relating to Access TO but also to refugees. And that's going to be up for vote by City Council, and if it's accepted, we will actually have for the first time a policy manual, some 50 pages outlining exactly what Access TO means, who the non-status population is, why it is that they're legally entitled to services in Toronto, what the expectations of city staff are, what the training modules will look like, who's going to be trained, follow-up mechanisms. There'll be regular compliance audits on an annual basis. And there's some discussion about doing some sort of attempt to discover what the demographics of the non-status population is in terms of the overall numbers, age, gender, country of origin, language, that sort of thing. So these are ambitious. We'll see what actually happens in City Council and if this goes through. One final thing that the Toronto Newcomer Office is keen to do is to start working in partnership with local municipalities, including Ajax, recently connected with the fine folks here in the town of Ajax, to talk a little bit about how GTA municipalities can band together. There's talk about expanding that to include Oshawa, Whitby, Brampton, Mississauga, etc. And I think that I shouldn't talk directly about the provincial election. I've been asked not to, but I will say that having a larger base of municipalities in the GTA band together and have a coherent policy platform on an issue that affects everybody would be very advantageous in terms of leveraging politically whatever provincial government comes into play. And like I mentioned, because the Toronto Newcomer Office already has connections with the IRCC, the Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada, there's opportunities there as well. So I see a very narrow but nonetheless important window of opportunity. A couple of things to mention in terms of limitations. I'm optimistic in public. I'm always optimistic in public and cynical in private, but for some reason I'm becoming more cynical in public. I don't know what's happening, but I want to point out some of the more negative things that are going on here with the Toronto Newcomer Office. And the first is that there is an anxiety, a fear of dealing with this issue. It's kind of like a secret. When we were talking with people in the Toronto Newcomer Office, they told us that when the federal government promised to fund this project, it said we don't want to have any conversation about the non-status population. The federal government has no policy on this issue. It has no real claim as to whether it considers sanctuary city policies to be legitimate or legal, unlike our friends to the south. The federal government has done nothing in this area. Our research team received an email from the federal government asking us if we knew how many non-status people there were in Canada, right? Which is a question that we should be asking of our federal government. Right? And so the Toronto Newcomer Office, while it's doing a lot of work, it's got a lot of barriers to face with the federal government that wants to pretend that this is not a problem and that it's not responsible for that problem. Right? And the second problem with this picture, this kind of rosy picture of opportunity that I've cast, is that the immigration, refugee, citizenship is only half of the immigration law arm. Right? The other half is the CBSA, and that's the enforcement arm. Those are the 7,000 or 8,000 uniformed officers whose responsibility is to detect, arrest, detain, and remove individuals who don't have authorization to be here. And the CBSA has extremely strong roots in Toronto. Montreal Police Force has been doing its best efforts to beat Toronto Police Force in reporting, and as far as I can tell, it beat Toronto in terms of the number of reports to the CBSA just last week. The numbers came out. So there's the dark side to what's going on, right? There's a dark side to the way in which local communities and the federal government can cooperate. And I just want to end by dispelling a couple of myths on that point, because this question will probably come up. Shouldn't the CBSA be enforcing immigration law? And shouldn't Toronto Police be helping the CBSA enforce immigration law? And my answer is no. No, the Toronto Police Service ought not to be doing that, except in extremely clear and narrow circumstances. And my reason for saying this is both moral and it's a legal response. Right? The reason it's a moral response and a legal response is because the Toronto Police, any local police's first job is to protect victims of crime. It's to investigate crime, and it's to facilitate the prosecution of criminal conduct. And if you have a local police force that prioritizes the enforcement of immigration law over ensuring that it has a sound working relationship with a community of migrants, then you're going to have a situation that we have now, well documented, that vast numbers of non-status migrants are not going to call the police if they're victims of crime or if they're witnesses of crime. And you can add to this that you've got great numbers of people in the private sector, including employers, abusive partners who can leverage the fear of being reported to exploit non-status populations. So I ask you, morally speaking, what is more important for a local police force to do? Should it be investigating and protecting people who are victims of domestic abuse or child abuse? Or should it be helping the federal government do its job? What's the priority here? Right? So I would say, of course, there are going to be some exceptions. Yes, if a non-status migrant has committed a crime, of course, the Toronto Police are going to report that individual. If the Toronto Police are given the name and address of somebody who is named in an outstanding arrest warrant, they're obligated, right, to refer that information. But that almost never happens. That almost never happens. The vast majority of the time, the police are voluntarily soliciting this information. They're using the fear of authority that they have to get information that is not relevant to criminal law or to criminal investigation. And why do they do this? I can do no better than to quote Chief of Police Mark Saunders when he tried to justify himself before the Toronto Police Services Board. And he said, it's because we share with the CBSA an identity as a public safety professional, and we respect their work. His words were public safety, not crime. It's public safety and public security, which is a very, very broad term, right? So I think it's very important for us to consider why this is happening It's not just immoral, it's actually not justified by law. The Toronto Police do not have the statutory or constitutional authority to be engaging in these sorts of practices. And again, I think it's sad when one points to the United States these days as an indication of the way to go. But there's two things I would say about the United States that we might learn a lesson from. And one is that many of the local police, especially in New York, actually have been more or less supportive of sanctuary policy. And they signed, 60 of them, chiefs of police, signed an open letter to President Trump explaining why it is that punishing sanctuary cities is contrary to sound law enforcement investigation. And the second thing is that the United States is very litigious, and they've gone to court over some of these issues. And we haven't seen that in Canada yet, but it might start happening if we don't start fixing things through policy. Thank you.
Maybe keep that one. Yeah. Great, thank you. I think that I appreciate that you've covered a lot of topics, and you've also addressed some questions which I think we will hear, or you have very well articulated some response that give people pause to maybe reframe their questions and understand the context in a new way because of what you've shared with us. You have, I'm going to go back to the one piece around Toronto as a municipality and speaking to Ajax, but recognizing these other communities that you've spoken about that are in the process of becoming sanctuary cities. What is your advice to them in terms of how to use those resources, sometimes very limited resources? You started by saying, you know, the budget was less than $1,000, right? So let's say that budget were a little bit bigger than that. What would you choose? Some of the promotion that you talked about, policy manuals, training, I mean, ideally everything at once, but if you had to sort of make some priorities in that.
Okay, I'm not sure that's working yet. Okay, so that's I mean, if I had a dream, yes, more funding. And I don't know that I would recommend promotional materials. I live in Oakwood and St. Clair, and there's a bunch of libraries and schools there, and I can't tell you the last time I saw an Access to a poster. It gets ripped down or covered right away. Okay. I think that's a substitute or a way of bypassing the real work that's required in reaching out to the community on the ground. Basically, what we've noticed in Toronto is what they did was they opened the doors metaphorically and said, "It's safe, come on into the city," but they didn't really go out into the neighborhoods and drive connections and try to identify ways of building trust and relationships. So that's one thing I would strongly recommend that the city do. The second thing that I would recommend is to work very seriously with training. There's problems with that, but I would agree with Mercedes that this is not, shouldn't be reduced to sensitivity training. Part of the problem is that the immigration law is so complicated that people they're very unclear about what non-status means. Yeah. You know, and I think it would be beneficial for people in any city to get a better sense of how the immigration system works, and that lots of individuals who are in a city can have different kinds of status. They could be a refugee claimant in process. They could be a failed refugee claimant but waiting on an appeal. They can be an individual who's overstayed a visa. They can be an individual who has crossed the border without authorization, which is entirely legal. By the way, you're allowed to do that and claim asylum. It's not illegal. You have examples of individuals who, because our immigration system is divided between the administrative arm and the enforcement arm, who have been granted status, but the CBSA doesn't know that and is trying to remove people. We've heard stories of an individual who had status here and was removed. And so for a city staff official, this isn't something that one comes across because it's not a municipal issue. So to have a better understanding of just the range of ways that somebody can fall in and out of status, but also to be aware, if you're working in the high-level policy, that you're dealing with a pretty large bureaucracy, and that you've got different roles and responsibilities. You've got people at the front line. You've got people who are taking phone calls. You've got people who are doing policy analysis. You've got all sorts of different kinds of roles, and each of them is going to need a different type of training, a different type of knowledge. So what I think would solve all of those problems in a direct way would be for there to be in every service area, whether it's in policing, whether it's in education, whether it's in public health, libraries. Each of these service areas should have at least one person who's an expert in this issue. And there should be a responsibility for that person to make sure that everyone in that service area is implementing the policy. And that's money well spent, in my opinion.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. And you're right, that complexity is there. We use very quick, short words and phrases for situations that maybe we don't know really underneath all the steps and bureaucracy and history that's gone into somebody's situation. So yes, there is undoubtedly a lot for us all to learn in terms of what those situations might be and what they are incorrectly. So.